Well, dear colleagues and friends, we will then resume after the break. I have introduced you, Wang Hui, many times, but I will try to resist this temptation. I would just say three words. Well, one word is that Wang Wei is undoubtedly one of the most important public intellectuals in the contemporary world. He has written more about the intellectual history of Qing, China, I think, than anybody else in the English language. And perhaps if you would like to read something about China, some of your more recent works, The End of the Revolution or China's 20th Century, or more historically, China from Empire to Nation State, published by Harvard, would be one of the best ways for such an introduction, as would Börje Ljunggren's new book. Wang Wei is, well, it's been you were editor of Dushu together with Huang Ping, and played a very important role. And I can tell, well, I know a lot about your history, biography. You've been a fellow also at the Wissenschaftskolleg, and Wang Wei is one of the scholars who come repeatedly within the framework of the Collegium Eisenstein program. So we are very happy about that. You spent most of this semester at Harvard, but you are now based at Tsinghua University, and you were the founding director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Sciences at Tsinghua, which we regard as a sister institution, and we are very, very happy to collaborate. Michael will make a proper introduction, but I will say one word about Michael Puett, who is Walter C. Klein Professor of History at Harvard University. He is also a Harvard College Professor as a recognition of his eminent teaching, and he has been chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard, and he's now actually chairing a large educational and scholarly unit at Harvard, the Committee on the Study of Religion. I think you're about 40 professors or something like that. So it's one of the largest institutions of this type in the world. Michael has written a lot. He's written on the ambivalence of creation. He writes about sort of early China, the Warring States period mainly. Written a very interesting book on the ambivalence of creation, published by Stanford 15 years ago. He wrote a book with a curious title, To Become a God, Cosmology, Sacrifice and Self-Divinization in Early China, also about 15 years ago, published by Harvard. And then a wonderful book edited book on ritual and its consequences, an essay on the limits of sincerity, published by Oxford some years ago. And more recently has published a book that many of you, it's hard not to come across this book. It's called The Path, What Chinese Philosophers Can Teach Us About the Good Life. And I might add that some of you may have been reading the newspaper The Guardian. On the 26th of March, it had an absolutely, I think, unique title. So there was a picture of Michael, and then there was the title, Can Harvard's Most Popular Professor, and then parenthesis sign, and Confucius, end of the parenthesis sign, radically change your life? And I think the answer was basically yes. so I think this is very dangerous territory. But Michael is also a long-term fellow here, and was last year elected foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. There are actually only 2 language professors in that academy. It's Michael and Göran Malmqvist. So this is as it should be. So Michael, please.
So thank you so much, Bjorn. It is such an honor to be here, and such an honor as well to have the opportunity to introduce Wang Hui yet again. I've embarrassed him many, many times, and I always love every opportunity, so let me embarrass you yet one more time. I first met Wang Hui actually in the early 1990s. I was studying in Beijing at the time, and my then advisor at Beijing University said, now, Michael, I've been introducing you to the intellectual world here in China, but there's another side you haven't seen yet. Are you free Wednesday night? And I said, well, sure, of course. And so he takes me in on a Wednesday night, and we walk into this building, and there was the most exciting collection of scholars, writers, authors, artists. It was this extraordinary group. And I leaned into my advisor and I said, what's going on and who brings them all together? And he points and says, it's someone I'm going to introduce you to now, Wang Hui. Literally, that's his tone of voice. And he introduces me to Wang Hui, and I immediately see why. Just this incredibly brilliant figure, incredibly charismatic, but as you'll see, in a very modest way. It's the charisma coming from his incredible incisiveness, his incredible brilliance, and he just draws people together through that brilliance. He very quickly, I was excited to see over the subsequent years, became one of the leading intellectuals in China, as Bjorn mentioned, co-editing Dushu, which became the sort of journal coming out of that group I got to see an early glimpse of, becoming really the leading intellectual journal of China. He has subsequently, after becoming arguably the leading intellectual in China, has really become one of the leading Chinese intellectuals in the world. In fact, he is the only human being I know who will casually begin sentences like, oh, well, yesterday when I was having lunch with Jürgen Habermas, ... which he truly will do because he is at that level. Truly someone that everyone around the world is listening to, thinking about, exactly as I saw in the early 90s with those 30 or 40 people stuffed into a basement, only now it's become a global phenomenon. And even most recently, I had the honor of hosting him at Harvard University, where he taught 2 classes, and that same magic that I saw in the early 90s continues. Our students just completely fell in love with them, so you're going to be invited back many, many times. As Bjorn mentioned, his main work, now in unbelievable numbers of titles, is focused on the intellectual history of late imperial and modern China, trying to rethink the entire notion of modernity in China, and by taking China seriously, asking us to rethink the development of modernity in general. And he is going to give us a little piece of that much larger project today. And Wang Hui, it's an honor once again to introduce you, and to all of you, I hope you will now see that magic that so many people have been able to see, where Wang Hui will lay out concepts and you will see them grow, alter, and be changed by the way he does so. So please join me in giving our warmest welcome to Wang Hui.
Thank you, Bjorn and Michael. It's really gracious introduction. Thank you so much. It's really happy and a great pleasure to be here again and share the tables with all of you, exchange ideas. And today I will talk about the beginning of the 20th century, actually the century issue. Can I use this one, right? Okay. So I just immediately started my talk here, and how to define the 20th century in China. That is the big issue for us. Okay, I'm so sorry. Here. So I added a PPT because I know that most of you are not specialists in the field of Chinese studies. So in order to make more clarification on these issues, I try to do something to introduce these. Because I grew up during the Cultural Revolution. I was there, and we are most familiar with the talk was this is a period that defines itself as different from all other past periods. So everybody say 20th century was most revolutionary radical period, which tried to define itself with distinctively different from all past. However, now the atmosphere, especially after the 1989, the situation changed. The first very famous slogan, the farewell to revolution. We talk about the revolution, but the most dominant slogans were the farewell to revolution, raised by a very famous Chinese leading intellectual and intellectual historian Li Zehou, Professor Li Zehou. He raised this issue almost equal to the Francis Fukuyama's thesis of the end of the history. It's almost like the end of the history. But some others will obviously try to insist that the history, the 20th century was still there. The second sentence I cited from the radical philosopher in France, the Alain Badiou. He did some research on the Cultural Revolution. In the first page of his book entitled "The Century," he said that this century already existed. looks like a very normal state, but actually try to be very provocative, because say everything we need to talk about contemporary issues is unavoidable to think about the 20th century. Already, 20th century has become the tradition for us to think about the reality and the past and so on and so forth. So for another issue is that in the historical studies, the last decades, I think it started from the end of the 70s. There was a turn, so-called the local history. The turning to the local history, like from Harvard University was the leading figures like Philip Kuhn and those people. Basically, they argue that the formation of the modern state in China should be interpreted as a process, China's process, rather than simply imported from the West or others. So which was a challenge to the very famous model in our field that was so-called the challenge and the responses, impact and responses, Western impact and the Chinese responses. But trying to interpret the Chinese formation was really the state issues and the social change was started from internal forces. So the Philip Kuhn's I think two famous books, one is about Taiping uprising. Basically, he saw that the collapse of the Qing dynasty was not the result of the Western invasion, but the internal process resulted from the Taiping uprising. It changed the social structures, center and the local and so on and so forth. Local militarization was one of the most important reasons. Another book was about the Wei Yuan. He talked about the state structure which can be traced back to the very early period. It was not also the so-called modern type of the state. It was not the invention of the later invention from the West, but can be traced back to the early period. So basically, they try to define these modern process determined by its internal historical developments, rather than in that kind of the model of the impact and the challenge models. So that's why now we need to re-raise the issue, how to define the position of 20th century in the history of China and also in the history of global history too. So before I move to interpret the beginning of the century, I would like to raise the issue. Is there a 19th century in Chinese history? That is a question, because we know that in European history, 19th century was so important. We talk about modernity. Even we talk about early modern or postmodern, actually, that started from the very idea of 19th century. That was so important. So that was, and I raised three very important books. And Eric Hobsbawm trilogy, the long 19th century, the age of the revolution, the age of capital, the age of empire. Of course, we know that he had a fourth volume that was the short 20th century, dated back to the 1914, and with the 1991. That was from the World War I to the end of the Cold War. And Christopher Bailey's book, The Birth of Modern World. One of the new achievements was by the Jürgen Osterheimer's book, The Transformation of the World, A Global History of 19th Century, which was translated into different languages, including Chinese, 3 big volumes. It was really a great book. I think how the different people define the 19th century here is Osterheimer. The 19th century was above all a time when unprecedented amounts of knowledge were accumulated and displayed in archives, libraries, museums, exhibitions, and encyclopedias, when the world was measured and mapped with a new precision, when its inhabitants were counted and classified and depicted in novel ways, and when information could be globally transmitted more rapidly than ever. That his basic idea was developed from these technological developments, penetrated into the everyday life, right? This is the basic issues. However, if you look at the the Eric Hobsbawm's book was started from the French Revolution and the British Revolution. The political system and the economy was two issues to defining the 20th century. That was so important. Obviously, we know that the fourth book, the short 20th century, entitled the Age of Extremes. In the beginning, if we remember that the first page he cited, I think, 12 the big names in the 20th century who blamed the 20th century. That means that nothing new. And what was new was the level of tyrannies. World War I, World War II, Cold War, tyrannies, and so on and so forth, surpassed the old histories and so on and so forth. But basically, this is the basic idea. So 19th century, for European history, most productive. And the 20th century, because of the wars, revolutions, turmoils, and tyrannies, and racism, and so on and so forth, were more or less thought as a not really productive period. But how to define that? Only a few pages for Eric Hobsbawm to talk about China, of course. It's a very, basically, it's a European perspective. So, here is the age. Basically, he talk about 20th century contrasted with the age of revolution, implying the 20th century was filled with violence and didn't leave us much legacy like French Revolution and the British Industrial Revolution did. So here, trying to think from another perspective. Here, the 20th century, maybe as the first century in Chinese history, let me explain it first. At the beginning of 20th century, the alien idea of the century and the Gregorian calendars vis-a-vis the traditional concepts of chronology in China emerged. That's the first time. The Gregorian calendar became dominantly used only after 1949 Communist Revolution, which means that the Communist Revolution was a universal views based on that universal view of the world. So before that was the 20th century idea. I will explain when that emerged, but together with multiple calendar systems, right? The Ganzhi calendar system, Emperor calendar system, Republic calendar system, and so on and so forth. They all use. Sometimes they also use that the Gregorian calendar, but after the 1949, that the standard calendar system was the Gregorian calendar system. So basically, in the sense, the 19th century, 18th century, and their sequence could be thought as the reversives of the 20th century. That was the notion of the century closely connected with the 20th century. When we talk about before that, nobody used that term, 世纪, right? The century, the translation from the English into Chinese is a 世纪, is a century. That exactly almost in the year of 1900. Before that, almost nobody used that, the idea of the century, to use that to indicate the timing. What's the timing of that? It's completely different, the idea of time, and also related to the space too. So so one of the function of the century obviously was the temporal demarcation, because 19th century, 18th century was very different. However, the 18th century, 17th century, 18th century, or the 19th century was the creation or invention by the people in the 20th century. So in order to have a universal history, you need to create your prehistory of the 20th century for Chinese. But on the other hand, the idea of the century is an understanding of singular propensity of time. When I use the propensity of time was translation from Chinese, that 时事 is a Confucian idea of the 时事, was not the time, but the propensity. Different forces inside of that space create the timing. That is a situation which rendered the history of others into a history of one's own. and while situating it within history in total for explanation and identification. So in that sense, the beginning, the emergence of the idea of the century shows the birth of the global synchronicity in the history of China. In that sense, in the modern geographical sense, that was the first time you have the universal idea of the century. So that's why I said, if we talk about 20th century as the first century in Chinese history, otherwise we cannot, though in the whole 20th century historiography follow the idea to use the medieval, modern, early modern, and so on and so forth with the idea of century too. So this is the sequence. So here, the China's 20th century as the age of revolution. I shifted that Eric Hobsbawm's idea. He saw that his age of the extremes, only 19th century was the century of the revolution, meaning that revolution was still more or less positive and productive. The 1911 Chinese Revolution as the most significant event, one of among the chain of events that marked the awakening of Asia, so-called, in the beginning of 20th century. We can see that the Russian Revolution of 1905, one of the reasons, several different, very complicated reasons, one of the reasons was the failure of the Russian-Japanese War, and it triggered revolution inside of Russia. So that war happened in northeast China. It's in China, not in Russia too, nor in Japan. And the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, that was that period. Turkish Revolution 1908-09, Chinese Revolution 1911. Maybe we can also see that because most of people perceive the 1917 revolution from the European perspective, basically the socialist revolution, working class revolution. But actually we can also perceive that the 1917 revolution from Asian perspective as one of the events, the serious events in so-called the awakening of Asia. So the interaction between the Russian and other Asian regions. We know that by the end of the 1917, the Bolshevik claimed that they gave up the order on equal treaties and to publish the declaration is a statement to the Islamic world, and mainly try to show that their attitudes toward Iran and Turkey, right? So that was the beginning of the self-determination moments in the region, the whole regions. So here the end was the Cultural Revolution in 1916 to 1976 as the last revolution in the 20th century. That the MacFarquhar's book was China's last revolution. Alain Badiou's book, their positions are radically different, but they trying to define the Cultural Revolution as the last revolution of the 20th century. So that is. I try to mention before I further involving discuss the beginning of 20th century. I want to list here, and I also talk on these two characteristics briefly. If we try to understand the Chinese 20th century, different events, of course, very sophisticated, very complicated. But I think two characteristics will help us to define the 20th century in China. One is the beginning of the century. The first, the continuity, what we call the continuity of empire and the nation established in the revolutionary state building process at the beginning of the short 20th century. Basically, I mention this because in the whole so-called chain of the revolutions in the early 20th century, we found the revolutions, national movements, and the disintegration of empires in 19th and 20th century, Russian, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Iran, Turkish, and all these were by the end of the World War I, that the Austro-Hungarian also disintegrated. But the fate of the Qing Empire at the first look very similar to the most of other empires. However, after all, the turmoil, fragmentation crisis, and alien invasions, the vulnerable republic finally managed to keep its unity based on the former territory and the population scale of the previous empire. So how to explain why it was in China that not like other countries, especially after the end of the Cold War, China became so unique. In that sense, it was unique because it's still the unified based on the Qing Empire that the 17th century onwards, with the only exception part of the Outer Mongolia, which was claimed the independence after the 1911 revolution. But basically, the territory and population, as well as a lot of the formation of the state and the social structures remain unchanged, or you found the continuity here. So how should we explain the continuity between the empire and the sovereign state? That is the first issue. The second, I think, the end of the 20th century, because the so-called continuity of the revolution and the post-revolution at the end of short 20th century. So we know that the 1989, that the demonstration, the revolution happened in Tiananmen Square, triggered a series of events in Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. Eventually, the whole Soviet system collapsed, Eastern European bloc collapsed. But only after the collapse, we see that at the beginning of that chain, where China was remained, politically speaking, economically speaking, was much more stable. Then we talk about it's the second economy of China, and how to explain that to the so-called continuity between the revolution and the post-revolution. So why after the ending of the age of extremes, China not only keeps the integrity of the political structure, population composition, and the size of the state, but also has accomplished or is towards accomplishing a market-oriented transformation on the basis of the so-called socialist state system. So how to explain that was, of course, continuity in quote. We need to question it, pragmatize it, not just simply thought that a natural process. But with these two questions, I try to explain the first question, the beginning of the 20th century. So here, the imperialism and the theorization of 20th century, I think. It's interesting. This is Liang Qichao, who was one of the most famous Chinese intellectuals, and also the activist in the 1898 reform. After the failed, he escaped to Japan, and then he visited America and other European countries, different issues. So it was in January 30, 1900, in Honolulu. He planned to visit America from Japan in exile. But he was stopped by his teacher, Kang Youwei, in Honolulu, because he knew that he need to take care of their reformers' affairs. So in that day, he published a poetry, long poetry. He talked about which is the so-called 20世纪太平洋歌, the song of the 20th century Pacific Ocean. That's what I can check. That was almost the first time when the Chinese intellectuals to employ the term of 20th century in their whole political discourse. And it's a combination, but it's very interesting. It's not the calendar issue. It's about timing, the propensity of time. It's a combination of the Gongyang theory of 3 H's, which was a very Confucian idea about the history, and the European idea of history of civilization. Basically, he used that the Gongyang was a Confucian idea about the history. They thought that the history unfolding in the process of which can be divided into 3 ages. The one is a chaotic period, 居乱世. Second was 生平, is more or less between the wars, peaceful, but between the wars, and eventually the great harmony. That was the Taiping. So basically, he also tried to employ the term of the Western idea of the civilization to divide that according to the Chinese traditional Confucian idea of the 3 ages. But he talked about the age of rivers. The first is China, India, Egypt, Asia Minor. The second was the age of continental sea, the Mediterranean Sea, Baltic Sea, Arabic Sea, and the Yellow Sea, as well as Bohai, that was the surrounding, the coast area. And then the age of the Great Ocean after Columbus, the time of national imperialism. He used the term national imperialism, partly because in the Europe at that time, that all these big powers were adopted, not the people talk about 19th century as a time, like Eric Hobsbawm argued that if you want to single out the one theme for the 19th century, that was the nationalism. However, if you look at the political formation, was mainly empires, right? The Russian, France, Britain, and the Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman Empire, and all the world empire. However, that was after post-French Revolution issue. So you need to think about the new formation of empire. That's why it's a combination of nation and empire. So that was, they used the term of the national imperialism. So in Chinese, it's a 民族帝国主义. So he used that term. That was, and also very interesting, he afterwards, in 1902 to 1903, he managed to visit America. He was shocked by the new form, new phase of the organization of production. That he talked about the giant genie of the 20th century, or the monster of the 20th century. That was the trust. He thought that the trust was, as a new organization of the production, was very important to explain the nature of our time. That was so-called the time of imperialism. The rise of trust was meant to redeem the evil of surplus production. The trust became increasingly intricate in organization and increasingly appropriated in management, which increased the amount of property in the US by several times. The American trust was the consequence of the excess, the productivity, and American imperialism, the consequence of the excess capital since the establishment of trusts, both ineffective as remedies. That is the basic, his idea. He started from national imperialism. Basically, is an explanation about the phenomena of imperialism based on the category of nationalism, nation and nationalism. But now he moved to the issue of economy, the new formation of the new organization of the economy. So he said that the imperialism is to sack other countries and reside in other societies with military force in order to expand one's influence and territory. Those countries declaring to be powerful in the contemporary world follow these isms with no exception. Their power of expansion has gradually moved beyond the Atlantic, Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, reaching out our country, but still not stopping. People of our country will either welcome or use it, or be conquered and destroyed. But what he really wants for this, he tried to rebuild China through the constitutional reform, basically according to the pattern of the Vienna system. These 5 powers were the legitimism was based on the royal lineage. So it's not a republic, it's really the monarch. It's a monarchy of 5 ethnicities. So he rebuilt that for the competition with Western powers, which means that rebuild China as a new empire and competed with Western powers. That was his ideas. And another, these are the journals was published in in Japan was by those exiled Chinese intellectuals and overseas Chinese students there. And here, one of the Feng Siran, who was the one of the young revolutionaries and editors, he also worked with Liang Qichao too. The title is one of the long essay. The title was on the development of the imperialism and the future of 20th century world. That was in the 1901, that book. He said that on the growth of imperialism and the prospect of the world in 20th century, today's so-called imperialism is greatly different from, I think this is a very important, the distinction between the Napoleonic imperialism, because the old pattern of the empire, and the new so-called national imperialism. The imperialism practiced in North America is, in fact, the territorial expansionism and invasionism. In short, contemporary imperialism is a form of Turbinism, namely a form of the robberyism. Turbin was born in the first half of 18th century. That was his explanation for that. Why it was America became so important as an indication for the new time. That was very important issue. And here, before that I explained that, I tried to explain another Japanese scholar and the revolutionaries, anarchist revolutionary. He was also the translator of the Communist Manifesto. He was killed by the Japanese government in 1911. He also published in 1901, Kotoku Shusi, who published The Monster of the 20th Century Imperialism. So that book was, I think it's important. Why? Because we know that in 1901, Liang Qichao's use of the imperialism, 1900, and the Feng Siran and Liang Qichao and the Kotoku Shusi are all in the same year, 1901, to talk about the imperialism. We know that in a Western the theory of the imperialism, we saw that the Hobson's book was the classics, was published in 1902. And Hiverding's Finance Capital was in 1910. And Kautsky's Ultra Imperialism was in 1914. And Lenin's book was in 1916. That was a genealogy of theory on imperialism, so which means that almost at the same time in East Asia, both in Japan and China, those leading intellectuals began to think about the nature of 20th century. One of the function of the term category of imperialism was to define the nature of 20th century. That's why the 20th century was not only about the time issue, temporal issue, by trying to use that to define the nature, which was distinctively different from early period. So that was, and why that was because the Kotoku Shusi argued that basically he used the term of the different from Liang Qichao. He argued that the Japanese imperialism was based on the nationalism rather than economy. If we're familiar with after the Hobson and Lenin, we always talk about the economic monopoly, right? That was the so-called expansion of that's the driving force for the expansion. But his argument was that Japan by then was still, compared to the Western powers, were much economically speaking, was still the mainly backward, the system, not reach the stage of monopoly. But why Japan became so expansionistic and imperialistic. So that's why he tried to interpret that imperialism from more or less subjective perspective, to talk about mentality, patriotism, nationalism, and so on and so forth, not from economic and the issues, more political rather than economic. But in China, that Liang Qichao, influenced by Kotoku Shusi, but later he focused on economic issues. Basically, Why was this is another, the order was that year, 1902. The 19th century is the period when the Europeans competed among themselves. The 20th century, the period when the Europeans competed with external powers. The former pivoted on the political competition and the later economic. So they shifted from political to the economic issues. Why they explain this? Because obviously it was the American-Spanish War. After the American-Spanish War, the issue of Cuba in South Africa and the Philippines in Asia were all and Hawaii became the new colonies of America. Why Chinese people became, at that intellectual became so sensitive to the change in America? Because they thought that in the later Qing period, in the last decades in the 19th century, those intellectuals thought that America was our model. It was mainly because of the republic. And in its declaration for the independence, claimed that they will not repeat what the Western powers did, the old empires. So that's why America was thought as the ideal type for the reform. However, end of the 19th century, marked by that war, the American and the Spanish War, they thought that the political difference between the political forms, what republic and imperial, was not decisive in its global performance at all. So that was one of the reasons. And another was the new form of organization of production was in America. And also they thought that the events was the Boer War, Britain in the South Africa. That was, on the one hand, was between these the European migrants, the new republics in South Africa, and the British attack, and the trade triggered competition among the Western powers. So that was and also that war also marked decline of the old British Empire. And then the Britain has become the new form, though it's still the imperial, but the reinterpretation of the British Empire should be based on the 20th century, that the new forms, together with the German rise, because in 1900 was the first year when the German, the economic sum was surpassed Britain, became the #1 in European countries. So the three issues, American, Britain, and German, together with Japan, the rise of Japan, was thought as a chain of the change from the old empires to the new era of the imperialism, which also was the parallel to the declining process of the Vienna system. That, of course, ended with the World War I. That was the beginning. That's why the people talk about that. And the Vienna, if we look at here, I just single out the Vienna system and the return of Liaoning to China, the Eight Nation Alliance and the preservation of Chinese integrity and so on and so forth. And that was because the 1900 Boxer Uprising and the eight Western nations that made the intervention into China. And America joined the Western powers to intervene into China. But Americans raised the issue, say, we need to remain China's integrity rather than each part separate China, because he was later figured they need to share the benefits from China with the early comers. So that's why they thought there is a new form of why it was not, though the old imperialism was military, but they focused on the economic, because that was also the performance and the arguments raised by America. So that's the issues. The concept of the century conveys an epistemology that fits device spaces and their historical lineages into a universal vision of synchronicity in which the relationships between China and the West, between the ancient and the contemporary, cannot be described with the binary categories, such as the West represented by science and technology and China by culture, nor can it be regulated with European version of the universalism. Of course, that was the period when the people argue from East and the West, China and the West. However, that the arguments from that binary discourse was only the symptom of China already integrated into the whole system. That's why that was the sequence of the synchronicity. The notion of the century symbolizes the birth of universalist conception of history and the contemplations on the internal imbalance of this universal history and the subsequent contradictions and the conflicts. So that's the issue. Because in the European sense and Russia, they talk about the socialist revolution, but the first wave was argue for the revolution for independence as a form against imperialism. So that's why the revolution for independence adopted a certain kind of elements to transform the old form of the production. That's why the combination of the social revolution and the political revolution was come together after the 1911 revolution, even before the communist revolution, already there. So here, now Asia and Africa have, okay, I'm so sorry. Now Asia and Africa have just undergone the incidents in Philippines and in the Transvaal. Future conflicts between independence and imperialism would be way more intense than the revolutions in European countries. That was the prediction at the beginning of the 20th century. Here, I try to see that how the historical views transformed in the very specific type. I mean, I focus on the first decade of the 20th century, the creation of the prehistory of 20th century and the contemporaneous correlation. The history of others as the prehistory of the century, which means that the prehistory of 20th century China came into being as it absorbs the external into the internal. These new political thinking had a certain anti-historical quality, breaking through the conventional borders of historical narrative, including narratives of others in political thinking. If the people familiar with Chinese political thinking from very early, when the Michaels felt that in Han Dynasty, Cao Zuo, Jia Yi, down to the Qing Dynasty, Huang Zongxi, Gu Yanwei, and all those people easily to make their political arguments by resorting to the early dynasty, either the ideal so-called three generations, San Dai, right, is a Confucian ideal world, or the pre-dynasties or pre-emperor's time to make their arguments. But 20th century completely changed in that sense. The history of others as the prehistory of the century. I just selected the titles of articles in the beginning of 20th century, how the people discuss about that. Russian Revolution, the Nihilist Party in Russia in 1903, and the French Revolution, Turkish Revolution, German Revolution, American Revolution, even Haiti Revolution, and some other revolutions. And the German question, British question, American question were all as the references for make the political arguments about the Chinese reality and the political future. In that sense, all these global history was reorganized into the narrative of Chinese history that the pre-20th century history. So when we talk about the Chinese history in the 20th century, you have to make the reference to all these issues. Even like the Iran Revolution, 1979 revolution here, that the later was still. Even now, the people, after 1989, people argue about the Scottish Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, French Revolution, and the British Revolution. Different patterns will argue for how to make the reform in China, right? So it's not about Qing and the Ming or the Song or the Yuan Mongolian Empire, but about others as the reference about our political future and the political reality. So the conception of the century and the political and the cultural debates in the early 20th century, the different types of the nationalism, globalism, the characteristics of the intellectual debate about the China and the West, the past and the present, discursively often resorting to the essentialist cultural differences, but substantially aiming to discern the position of China in the new global relations, namely the positions on the axis of time and of space. Here, I just single out the several dimensions of that debate, the so-called singular and the universal. The first is about the dimension of time, how to use that time, evolution of history, social formation, and the national. Here, we know that the social Darwinism and the work was translated into China. And here, these were very important, Thomas Huxley's Evolution and Ethics. There was not a typical translation because with the footnotes, he absorbed a lot of the Huxley's, or Herbert Spencer's idea into the translation. And also Edward Young's The History of Politics, which was published in Britain in 1901, but it immediately translated into Chinese in 1903. Basically, the idea of the so-called history of politics were constructed a universal narrative of the global history to talk based on the idea of the social formation, from the barbarian, let's say, the society, to the patriarchal system, and to the nationalism. That was a universal. But that kind of teleological social Darwinist narration of the history immediately confronted the debates and criticized by intellectuals. Zhang Taiyan was the Lu Xun's teacher. Lu Xun was more famous later, but he was a real great thinker in the later Qing period. He talked about the paradoxical evolution, meaning that the goodness was ever-loaded, but also the evil also ever-loaded, sometimes descended. It's not just the counter forces. And he tried to provincialize the formation, the general narrative of history based on the European experience, but not simply argue for the singularity of Chinese history, by trying to provincialize the Chinese history too, to see that try to compare, for example, the patriarchal system in different locations in Europe, different forms, and different timings are different forms. And the patriarchal system in Chinese early history and the later history was also very different. So that was the issue. And he tried to argue all these kind of the questions about the timing issues. Here, the second part, I just in all the same time. The second was the dimension spatial issues. At that time, this is Yang Du, another reformer and a very famous figure in the later Qing and in the early 20th century. He talked about the Jin Tie Zhuyi. Jin was gold. Jin is yellow metal, money, and the economy, and the Tie, black iron, cannon, and the military. I'd like to see China becoming a country of Jin and Tie. And in other words, economic state and also a military state when synthesized economic warring state. He employed the term of warring state to define the era of the so-called nation state and the new imperialism. So he tried to reconstruct China as a new imperialist country too, like Liang Qichao at that time. So what is called the land of China today are the union of the land of 5 ethnicities, who are called the people of China today, a union of people of the 5 ethnicities, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, Islamic, and Han Chinese. That was the old empire. So who come together on one governing power to form a country. Around these country, very strong countries await an opportunity to invade. Hence, the theories of the preservation of territory integrity and opening are developed to resist partition. So that is the idea of monarch of five ethnicities. And then at that time, there was a huge debate about how to define China, based on the geography, culture, ethnicity, political systems, and so on and so forth. That kind of debates even continued now. It's because into the new age of globalization raised the issue of identity crisis. So how to identify China, how to do that was the debates about the space. And so spatial issue was not only the territory issue, but also the self-identity issues. So is it cultural China or political China? That was Zhang Taiyan raised a very famous issue. The essay was 1907, the first time that in the publication to use the term of the Republic of China. He tried to explain the Republic, what will be the Republic of China, culture, political, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, all these issues. So, but eventually, after the 1911 revolution, what the new idea prevailed was the Republic of five nationalities, or the five ethnicities. The debates on the national question among the socialists, I talk about Lenin, Otto Bauer, Luxemburg, Kautsky, because that time was those socialists, in European socialists, were a huge impact on China. There was a debates about the national question, right? We know that especially like Otto Bauer, he talked about the cultural autonomy, right? Try to remain the integrity of Austro-Hungarian Empire, but to give the autonomy of the cultural autonomy, to argue for that. And also the Rosa Luxemburg criticized Lenin for its theory of self-determination, basically based on his experience about the Poland, Ukraine. He said that these kind of arguments for the right to self-determination only beneficial to the bourgeois and the aristocracy. And she wanted to have the so-called proletarian revolution, right, the working class revolution. But Lenin argued for the self-determination. But self-determination, he talked about the theory of the self-determination was founding the most important decisive the nature of the self-determination was the right to withdraw from the empire, right? That's the basic, the right to withdraw. But Lenin had never talked about the Mongol or Tibetan or Islamic regions withdraw from China. He never talked on this. Rather, he talked about the backward north that the Chinese Revolution should overcome. Why? He did these kind of the arguments because basically he talked about the geopolitical thinking. It's if those nations withdraw from Qing, then immediately under the threat from Russia, Japan, and British in that region. So he thought that was almost like a Hungary, Czech want to stay within the framework of Austro-Hungarian. The second was that he tried to compare Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire because Russia was the center part was more backward compared to the European sides. And those countries like Austro-Hungary was center part was more advanced. And for him, in China was the same as the Austro-Hungary. That the center part was, economically speaking, more advanced, which will be beneficial to the economic developments in the frontier regions. So that was the idea. But after the 1911 revolution, what the idea of the prevailed was the Republic of five ethnicities. Here, the question that the Republic of China confronted, not whether to reject the other ethnicities or not, but to consider the political decision, which system to adopt. The prefectures and the county system of pre-Han dynasties, or the direct control of provinces in the Ming dynasty, the geopolitical situation in the era of imperialism, that the Korean, Vietnam, Burma, Tibet, Mongol, and the Hui area. because it was still the big question among debates, because culturally speaking, Korean, Vietnam, Burma was much closer to the center of China. And the Tibetan, Mongolian, Hui area, linguistically, religiously, and so on and so forth, compared to those countries, was more remote. Why we need to include these areas into China and not include the Korean, Vietnam, and Vietnam? It's not because of cultural determination. It's because of colonial situation. It was the geopolitical situation. Vietnam was occupied, it's the French colony, and the Korean was the Japanese colony, and Burma was British colony. There was no way for China to fight with all those big powers. So it's not the cultural determination. It was something just happened in the geopolitical situation. So here I want to, and then the third dimension of interosity, sign language and the subjectivity. If we look at the 20th century, we perceive the radical transformation of the linguistic moments. It's different kind of the linguistic moments. In the metaphors, it started from later Qing, and in the metaphors it became most important vernacular moments, and later continued after 1949. So here, I try to argue that the linguistic and the different forms, even the arts, was always related to the self-identity, how to identify yourself. Here are the two forms of the understanding or interpretation of the linguistics. One by the Wang Wei was one of the most important figure, Confucian scholar and a thinker, and he was exiled in Sweden. He spent here for the 4 years, and later he published The Great Harmony, that's the utopian work. And after the Indian and the Sweden, he produced that kind of the work. The spoken and the written language are man-made and have infinite possibilities, but easier and simpler versions are adopted because they are sufficient to facilitate the communication. They are unlike the mathematics, law, and the philosophy, which have certain inalterable axioms or principles. Therefore, complex and corrupted linguistic elements will be abandoned and the languages merge to form one system. That's why the vernacular movement started from even so radical to the level that a lot of the radical Chinese intellectuals decided to give up the Chinese written forms, to adopt those anarchists who, based in France at that time, tried to adopt the Esperanto as our national language. He said that if Esperanto not work, at least we need to adopt the French first, not the English. Only after the World War II, then the English became dominant. Basically, that's the idea about the language as a tool for the communication. But here, so that's why the right must be abandoned, and we must adopt the Esperanto. He said that. But the Zhang Taiyan, again, the Lu Xun's teacher, he developed a different understanding of the function, the role of language. He said that writing is a science for the language. Language is banners of thought. Though languages are natural, but it's not because they existed in the universe from the beginning. The origins of languages by the efforts of man. Hence, the language roughly conforms to human happenings if there are disturbances in human events. So will language and writing be disturbed. Basically, the language was mainly for the self-expression rather than for the communication. The communication was secondary. Self-expression was the first. So that was give the priority of the Chinese language. The old form and the new form were all the self-expression. So that was also, it's trying to the linguistic issue, a cultural moments issue, was the issue that's trying to construct the relationship between we and ourselves, right? So it's the literary arts and so on and so forth became so prominent, prosperous in the 20th century China. Because basically I mentioned that the 19th century here in Europe was really great. You have French novels, Russian, you get Tolstoy, and all those peoples. But 19th century in China was not that great. I thought the 19th century from Chinese perspective was a declining process from the height of the 18th century, like the Ray Chambers dreams and so on and so forth, and also the great philology and so on and so forth. That was the 18th century. 19th century was only the sequence from there and the declining. But then we perceive the 20th century. A lot of the inventions, political system, literature, arts, and so on and so forth were in the 20th century. Without 20th century, it's very difficult to understand contemporary China in any case. So the last dimension, I will talk about the so-called transcendence. That was religion, morality, and social ideas. I just briefly, because Said also mentioned that the religious, communist revolution as a religious revolution. But here we will talk about later, but these were the overlooked aspect was early revolution was a lot, the religious issue was integrated. It's really the seeds there, because that I used the Lu Xun's term. Can you see that the Lu Xun was a so-called enlightenment figure? But he said that the urgent task before us today is to rid of ourselves to the hypocritical gentry. Superstition itself may remain. What's the hypocritical? He thought that the enlightenment figures thought now you have the national citizen or you are a cosmopolitan. That was for him. So he said that even the superstition, maybe we need to remain. So we can find a lot of during the most radical revolutionary moments, you also found the radical moment for the construction of religion inside of the religion. So the Confucianism as a religion raised by Wang Wei, Buddhism as a philosophy of revolution raised by Zhang Taiyan and Liang Qichao. And Sun Yat-sen was famously, he was a Christian. So he thought that maybe Christianity was be used for the Chinese Revolution too. And that was, so I hear that Liang Qichao said, I regard Confucianism as education and not a religion. It emphasizes the practice and not faith. Our country confronts a momentous problem where politics in China progress for lack of faith or due to the presence of faith. I argue faith has to be based on religion, which is not an ultimate principle of civilization. These sentences are almost overlooked by most of the intellectual historians, because Liang Qichao was thought as a liberal enlightenment figure. And how, if we look at what happened now, to see some seeds inside of the 20th century were radically secularized, but the religious elements, seeds were there. So here I just use that those people, and also later, not only about the traditional, the religions as we talked about now, but also the anarchism, communism, and so on and so forth. Different social ideas competed with those ideas. And also the Chinese traditions like Mozi, and those were also constructed as a religion. It's most factional religious sides for practice. So here, I end here with the conclusion here. The revolution and the invention of continuity. For me, the national revolution movements, like combined with the bourgeois constitutional democracy, allied with social revolutions and the state building moments of a certain socialist color, was quite universal at that time. The link between revolution and the continuity, for me, was neither a destiny of history nor the product of some cultural norms. Born in the unfolding of the specific historical events, without the outbreak of revolution, there will not be an issue of continuity, as we discuss here, but continuity cannot be simply treated as a natural extension of revolution, because the whole basic ideas, those people, even more conservative, more revolutionaries, just like from the monarchy of 5 ethnicities to the republic of 5 ethnicities, the whole idea about China came from early experience. So that's what provided the foundation for the new form and reform and revolution. If without that, the 20th century, when we talk about China now, it's maybe very different. Maybe we talk about the Turkey or the Austria or some other countries. That was very different, the situation here. So thank you.